Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode from the RPA Vanguard channel. My name is Andy Menon. In this session, we are going to take a closer look at another reusable library of the Solution Accelerator template, and that is generically called the Data Collection Reusable Library. Let's get started. If you are watching this video for the first time, I would recommend that you go back to the RPA Vanguard channel and look through this playlist and go through some of the previous videos in the UiPath Solution Accelerator video series. And the reason I'm saying that is I will not be covering a lot of stuff that has already been covered in these 3 videos. And therefore, if this session has to make any sense, I would truly appreciate it if you dedicate some time to go through the first 3 parts. In the last part, we left off our journey in this video series by covering the generic reusables library, right? And in this session, we are going to be looking at the data collection reusable library that comes as part of your Solution Accelerator template download. So in this session, what you'll be looking at is how I have repurposed that generic data collection reusable library and adapted it to be used in my implementation. In the previous videos, we also covered the entities and the data set that is going to be loaded into our data service, right? And if you're new here, then this data set is called the Annual Concentration Monitor. And that is why you see this acronym ACM prefixed to all the entities, right? And if I go back into my data service for the orchestrator instance or the automation cloud instance, sorry, that I'm using for this demo, you will also know that these entities have already been created. And along with those entities, I have also created those choice sets. Now, the detailed discussions on how these entities have been broken up and how these choice sets have been created has already been covered in the previous videos. This is what you see here, the entity, the ACM concentration data is the actual core data that you're loading into your entity named ACM concentration data, right? And on the left of this core entity are all the strong entities. The data in these entities must exist before data can be loaded into the core entity. And if you swing over to the right, the entities that you see that are color-coded to plum, right? They are attributes of the entity that are loaded as other dependent entities, right? So for example, ACM parameter is associated with the core entity ACM concentration data by parameter code, right? And similarly, ACM POC is associated with the ACM concentration data by POC, right? And on the far right, the objects that are color-coded in brown, they are choice sets, right? And if you look at the attributes of the choice sets, they are very limited in number, right? The next thing that we're going to be looking at is a snippet of sample data. We have covered this fully in the previous videos, but again, just to breeze through, you will see that the strong entities are identified by their respective color codes. The plum entities are again, identified by their respective color codes, and the choice sets are in brown. So that will kind of help us associate what is the kind of entity or what is the kind of choice set that this particular attribute in a certain record or in this data set in general, belongs to, right? And therefore, if you go to this sample data set, you can track or make your way back to the ACM entities so that you get familiar with the nature of the data. Before we dive further into this data collection reusables library, I just want to kind of lay out, my frame of thought on why we would need a data collection library, right? The argument would be, hey, why can't we load all the data in a single, client process? Why do we need a library at all, right? So I have laid out this schematic, and we'll go over this to kind of, elaborate on the idea of why we need a data collection reusables library. Now, on the top left here is the Excel that you saw, right? And it contains some data. And then every row is a record for that data that you are going to be loading into the data service. This client process will consume that data, right? Every row of the data. And then what it will do is it will interact with this library here through what are called as library methods, right? And this is called the external interface, right? And this library has reference to the actual data source where the data is recorded, right? This is the UiPath data service, and this row ultimately gets loaded as a data service record in UiPath data service. And this data service library has got a reference to that UiPath data service that you are going to be loading data into. But here is the good part. The library exposes the data service entities that are in this data service as objects, right? As abstract objects, and the client process will have no knowledge or direct knowledge of the data source where you're loading the data into, right? So the client process takes the raw data and it interacts through the methods exposed by this library, and it creates objects, abstract objects, and passes the raw data into these objects, and then calls the proper library method to either create the data service entity record or load or fetch that record from data service from the backend data service system of records, right? And therefore you can see the advantage here. The first advantage is that there is abstraction of the actual data source from the client process, which means that your client process is going to be very small, very lightweight, and easily maintainable, right? The second is that this is loosely coupled. Tomorrow, if your backend data source changes, if you're moving away from data service and into some other data source, right, like a SQL Server database, you could still repurpose this library or switch out a library for the client to use. And instead of using a data collection reusables library, you might be using another library to load data directly into another database. Or you could straight away repurpose this library, because as long as these object signatures do not change and the method signatures do not change, the only thing that might have to change here would be the reference to the new data source. And if you swap this out, you could still keep these objects abstract enough so that the client has no clue that you have swapped out your data source, right? So that's loosely coupling. And then there is the separation of concerns, right? The separation of concerns means the client process does not have to concern itself about which database or data source your data is going to be loaded to. That is not the responsibility of the client process. The responsibility of the client process is basically to consume this data and then load it into the final database or data service into the data service entities, or read the data back from the system of records without having to know the excessive details. And therefore, you can see that this dotted line kind of indicates that the client has no direct knowledge of the data service record or the system of records, right? And this is why you would want to implement something like a data service library when you are implementing a solution in the enterprise space. So picking up from our previous videos in the series, this should be already familiar to you. I have downloaded the Solution Accelerator template, and you get a folder called Excel Template Data Extractor. I have created a separate a folder with the -dev suffix. And then here you can see that the Solution Accelerator template comes with its own sustainability data collection reusables. And that is because the data service that has been used as an example in this Solution Accelerator template has got to do with loading sustainability data, right? And this is the library that is provided to you as an example, right? Now, you can go through this on your own and you can try to understand how it works. But what I'm going to be showing you is how I took this and implemented the ACM data collection reusables library, right? All right, so we are in Studio, and what you're looking at is the ACM data collection reusables library that we just spoke about. Now, the first thing that you want to do, if you are taking a copy of UiPath's library template and going to repurpose it for your own needs, the first thing you need to do is to delete the entity's reference, right? It is possible, most often than not, it's possible that you are not working with the sustainability data, right? And therefore, those entities have no merit in your implementation of the library. And the second thing is the entities and the choice sets that you need must already have been created in your data service, right? And the third thing is, obviously, you need to be connected to your instance of the automation cloud and be in that folder, right? So that you get access to the entities that you need to pull into this project, right? And when I say entities, and I go back to this PowerPoint slide, this black, artifact here refers to that entity widget that you saw in Studio, and that's where we are going to be, focusing on at this moment. So how do we add this? That's pretty easy, provided you're connected to your automation cloud and you have access to these entities and choice sets. What you do is you go into Manage Entities, and then you choose all the entities you need, right? And you give them a namespace, right? And based on the naming convention of the example in the UiPath library, I have named my namespace ACM data collection reusables, right? Because ACM is the identifier for my data, which is annual concentration monitor. And data collection reusables is the standard convention that UiPath has used in its Solution Accelerator, right? You don't have to, but in the interest of keeping some consistency, I have kind of used that convention, right? And you will not see the choice sets here, and that's because the choice sets are set as attributes for one or more of these entities, and therefore, when you set references to your entities, you will also get references to those choice sets, right? And you will see that when we go through some of the library methods in this in this project, right? So once you're done, you can, when you save and exit, you will see references to all of these objects in this library, right? And therefore, going back to this slide again, this is the library, and here is the entity reference. The entity reference is associated with your actual data source, which is your data service in your automation cloud. And then this entity reference exposes these objects using which you can now develop library methods that can be then exposed to your client. So let us now look at the structure of this library. I have kind of created these folders here, and each of them indicates what it does. And we will go through what each of these things do, right? I mean, what does data transformation mean? What does master record operations mean, etc. But the main piece of code is the record operations, right? The record operations basically has files under this folder where you will be loading data into your core entities, right? Now, if I go back to my entity diagram, the core entities are ACM data information and ACM concentration data, right? These are the two core entities, right? Because ultimately, these two entities actually represent a single record, right? A single record that comes out of this data set, right? And therefore, these are put under record operations. And you can see that they have been prefixed with create and then the name of the entity and then say the data record, right? Now, here is the first object that or the first flow that we are going to open, and it's called create ACM data information record. Obviously, I have changed some of the comments and made it applicable to my use case. And then I have added, the logging. And one of the things that I have left as is would be the retry mechanism, right? And this is a good comment to read about retry. When you use retry mechanisms, you will also have to understand the fact that they will involve burning through additional API calls, right? And you know that if you're familiar with data service, you get a certain number of data service units that you can burn through in a day when placing API calls to the data service in the automation cloud, right? So these are some of the good things that you might want to read through and understand, and then research before you start implementing your library. Here, you can see that the create entity record activity is pretty lean, right? And there are a couple of methods in which you can call this create entity record activity. One is the fields view, right, which is not visible here. So if I click on this, you will see that you have to supply the actual attributes that you will have to load into this entity, right? So this is the more granular way of using create entity record. Then there is the record view, right, which is what we are using here. And you will see the advantage later. But if you switch to the record view, you will be passing in an object of type ACM data information record, right? That is the generic object that you have here. ACM data information record, right? If I go up here and if I ACM data information record, right? And further going down into this arguments palette, you will see that the number of arguments to this flow are very small. You pass in the number of attempts, the retry interval, because you are using the retry mechanism, and then you are passing ACM data information object as an in-out parameter or an in-out argument, right? It's very, very compact, very clean, and very easily understood, right? But if you switch to the fields view, then this is much more transparent. But then the problem is tomorrow, if your ACM data information has got additional parameters and they are all required parameters, then you will have to come in here and you will have to change the number of arguments that you're going to be passing in to this library method, right? And that's going to be a change because every time your data service entity undergoes a change, then you'll have to come back here and change the library method, right? Which is not very convenient and not a good way of having to implement your library. The second folder that I would want to prioritize here is the data transformation, right? We will come to the detail on data transformation when I explain how an entity is loaded into data service. But in brief, what data transformation does is it takes the raw values that are coming in from your raw data and then transforms that into an entity object, right? So if I get a record from my Excel and I want to load county information, then I'll have to take the values associated with the county and then transform it into an ACM county object. Similarly, if I'm loading data on methods, then I'll have to take the attributes from the data, the raw values, and then transform that into an entity of ACM method name, right? And therefore, you will see that if you go into data transformation, you will find one method for each of these entities in this folder, right? So that pretty much wraps up the organization and the setup of or construction of this library, right? In the next section, what we'll be looking at is one example of how this this library is used to load data into the data service entity. All right, I thought that it was better to explain this by putting the entire flow in a couple of slides. And the reason I say a couple of slides is because this entity, this data service entity layout has got broadly a couple of different entities, right? Broadly, the first type of entity is a totally strong entity, an independent entity, an entity that can exist by itself without having to depend itself on something, right? At least in the context of this file. And that entity is the state. So before the Environmental Protection Agency can capture annual, concentration data from the environment throughout the United States, they have to know which state they're monitoring it. And therefore, this ACM state information has to exist. And this is a very strong entity, right? The next level or the second type of entity are dependent entities, right? They're not very strong entities, they're dependent entities, because if you look at the county depends on the state, right? And therefore, the method of loading a strong entity and the methods of loading a not so strong entity or a dependent entity are slightly different, right? And if you keep going to the right, you will see that these entities, as they go to the right, are dependent on the entities, one or more entities, for their information. In these slides, we will go through two examples. One is to load the ACM state, a very strong entity, and then we'll follow that up by loading ACM county, and we will see what are the differences in both these methods. And then you can take this explanation, this example, and then extrapolate that to the rest of the entities. And you can make sense of all the methods that are sitting here. All the methods and all the flows that are sitting here have been created in this ACM data collection reusables library. And therefore, let's start with the load sequence of how ACM state data is loaded, right? This is a very simple entity. It has got two attributes, state code and state name. And the data that comes in has got those attributes readily available to us, right? And therefore, here you can see state code is 16. And if I go all the way to the right, the state name is, I think, Idaho is the state name, Idaho. So state name and state code. These are the only two attributes that need to be loaded. So how are we going to load this if a client project is going to be using this library, right? And here you will see how a typical independent entity is loaded into the data service. First, your client is going to consume this file, right? your client project, your client process is going to consume this file. And then it is going to take every row. And this is your input. A single row in your data coming in is the input. Now you will see that these are unmastered raw values. Basically, you have them in raw format and you haven't converted them into an entity record, right? Now, the state record is a master entity, right? It needs to exist before the core data is loaded. Therefore, what you're essentially doing is you are first transforming this into an entity, and then you are going to be loading that entity record into the ACM state entity in your data service, essentially creating a master record. Now, how does that happen? So we start from here. The row comes in. It has got two raw values, state ID and state name. So this is of type data row. And then the client calls the library method get master state information. Now, what this method is doing is basically checking to see if the state is already existing in my ACM state entity. Because states have to be unique, right? You can't load duplicates. And therefore, this method here, this library method actually queries your data source, your data service entity. And it tries to see if your ACM state entity exists in data service. Now, if the entity already exists, then it simply returns that ACM state entity object. And the process stops there because now the client can take that ACM state entity and then doesn't have to take any action because there is no need to load that record again, right? But in case that entity record does not exist, then you follow through with the transformation method, right? And here you call ACM state transformation, right? You take the raw values from here and then you convert those raw values into an object of type ACM state. So once that is done, you will now need to load this ACM state entity into the data service. And then you call the library method, a create library method called create ACM state data record that loads this record into the data service entity named ACM state. So let's start from here. Let's go into get master state information method in our library. So I'm going to go into master record operations, and I am going to open this method get. I'm going to close everything first. Get master state information. So let's start by looking at the arguments. The argument is of type raw value state code, which is int32, state name, which is string, right? And then the ACM state record is an in-out argument of type ACM state. So if you go back here, you can see that the raw values are input to ACM master state information. And what you do is next you query the entity records, you query the entity ACM state, you assign two filters to it. And if you look at it, I'm saying, can you check if a state code of code value 16, in this case our example, and state name Idaho exists? Now, if it exists, right, then the list carrying that entity will be returned, right? And therefore, this output, which is the list of ACM state data, right? And here you can see the variables. It's called LST underscore ACM state data. It's an I list of ACM state. That will return a record if the state of Idaho already exists in ACM state. And if it exists, then you take the first value in that list and return it as ACM state record, which is your in-out argument. So once you have performed this check, right? Once you have performed this check that whether this entity exists or not, you get a return type, ACM state record. And if that record is not already existing, right? If it's not already existing, let us assume that it is not already existing. we have to now follow that up with ACM state transformation, right? So now I'm going to open that library flow. I'm going into data transformation, and I'm going to say ACM state transformation. And like I said, the ACM state transformation flow converts the raw values into an entity of type ACM state. And here, again, we instantiate an empty instance of ACM state. And then you can see that the argument is of type current row, which is data row, right? That is the Excel row that is coming in. And then you are going to assign the data that is coming in from your current row as individual attributes to ACM state. Of course, this ACM state has got only two attributes, and that is state code and state name. And one of the things that you have to note is that when you're pulling data from current row, you have to perform the transformations. In this case, the state code data that's coming in from Excel is of type integer in your data service, and therefore you got to convert it into int. Similarly, your state is going to be of type string, and you got to convert the state name into type string. And once you create that, you return the ACM state entity as output. And if you go back to our slide, this is what we have done here. If the entity does not exist, you transform it using this method, and then you return the ACM state entity. And we also saw that if the entity already exists, it is very simple. You simply return that entity, right? Now, what if you want to create it, right? The next thing is you have the ACM state entity already in hand. You might want to create it, right? So here is another method called create ACM state data record, right? If I go back into the library again and go into master record operations, remember, state is a very strong entity. You have already now transformed it, and now you're going to master it, right? So here, there is this create ACM state data record method, right? I open it, and this is the simplest because you have done all the heavy lifting in the previous two methods. This is super simple. If you look at the arguments, it's a very simple in-out parameter called ACM state, and then a couple of parameters for your retry mechanism. All you do is pass the ACM state record, which is already populated with the raw values, and then you create an entity record of type ACM state. So once this method runs, your ACM state record is created in your data service entity. So if I go back to my data service entities, and if I go to ACM state, if I look at data, you can see that the record for 16 Idaho would be created, right? So this is how we load very strong entities, right? Very strong entities. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is how to load this entity, ACM county, right? Now, in this case, the procedure is slightly different, and we're going to look at that through this second slide. All right, so here again, we have a slide that looks similar to the one that we discussed earlier, but this is slightly different and a little more involved. Now let's start with our data here. So again, we have the data, and let's assume that we are getting the same data record from Excel, which is of type data row. Now we will be loading the county information, right? If I go back here, I'll be loading the county information. If I go to the sample data, if I slide all the way to the left, I have county code, and I have the attribute county name. And I think the county name is Ada. If my memory serves me right, the county name is Ada. But these are the core information exclusive to that county. But the information is not complete if it is not supported by the state information, right? And therefore, the associated state data also needs to be complete, right? So if we go back to our slide, here what we do is we call the transformation library method ACM county transformation. Remember, we are trying to take the raw values and transform it into an ACM county object. The first thing that this transformation method does is check if the state information is available. It calls the method called get master county information. So what is the master record for that county? It is the state, right? And therefore, let's now start looking through this one by one. I'm going to open this method, ACM county transformation. I'm going to go into data transformation, ACM county transformation. Let me close all of these. ACM county transformation. And here you can see the first thing it does is it creates an empty ACM county instance, and then it assigns the base values for the county, right? What are the exclusive values for the county? The county code, the county name, the latitude and longitude, right? They all come from your current row. And if you look at this, this is of type decimal. So we are converting it into, we are using CDES to convert latitude and longitude to the right data type. And once you've assigned this, the core information of county is complete, but the master information is not yet complete. And therefore, you're going to be calling this method called get master county information. And this flow is called get master county, and it's inside master record operations, right? Get master county information. And if I open that flow, I am now querying the state entity to check if the state for that county is already available, right? It's already available in our system of records. Again, it's the same thing. We covered this earlier. You're going to give the state code and the state name. And if that exists, it should be returned. Now, remember, if your state entity does not exist by then, that means you're not loading data in the proper manner. You should technically not reach here unless you have a system failure, not because of data failure, right? So you should not reach here. If it reaches here, that means your data is incomplete. You'll have to load the state information first and then load the county information, right? So if you've done things right, you should not reach here. Your state information must already exist and it must be returned to this method here, right? And therefore, your execution must stop here, right? You will get that ACM state information, and therefore your control must flow in here. It should exist. And then what you do is if it exists, then you assign the ACM county state code from the entity that has been, the state entity that has been retrieved from your data service entity. You see that LSD ACM state data of 0. And when you do that, the association that you've created in your data service entities will be formed here. So state code and state name, pretty simple. Assign it to the state entity that you have retrieved from your search operation. And at this point, your master record information is complete. But there is another small bit that is still left, right? If we go back to our entity diagram and look at ACM entities, there is a choice set named datum. And if you look at it, it has got a couple of methods of identifying latitude and longitude. And if you look into the sample data, there is something called datum here. And that has been loaded as choice set, right? And I need to assign the choice set to this ACM county entity to make that information complete, right? So the next step for me is to transform or assign that datum choice set to my ACM county entity, right? And this is where we are. So we came up here, we assigned the state entity information. The next thing that we want to do is convert the raw datum value to CS datum choice set. Now, remember what I said, when you pull entities into your project, the choice set objects will not be visible to you in that entity setup dialog, but because of the associations that you've created in your data service entities, you will be able to refer to them with the name of the entity that you have created, right? For example, the name of my choice set is CS datum, and therefore you will be able to refer to that here as CS datum, right? And I have set up a variable here called CS datum item of type CS datum. And that's why I've adopted a standard naming convention. If I want anything of choice set, I should be able to query it using CS, right? The identifier CS. So here what we do is we have this CS datum item of type CS datum, and I take the raw value from here, which is WGS84, and convert it into a type choice set, right? So this is how generically you do the parsing and convert a raw value into an enumerable, right? So I say CS datum dot parse of CS datum value, where datum value is the raw value that is coming in from your record, right? And you convert that into CS datum item, and then you assign that to ACM county dot datum. And the object that you're assigning is CS underscore datum underscore item, right? So by this point in your flow, you have created an ACM county entity, which is associated with its master information, ACM state entity, and also any choice set optionally, which you have created for your ACM county, and that is the ACM, that is the choice set datum object, right? All of this assigned, your ACM county entity is complete, right? And obviously the next step would be for you to create it. And to create that, you're going to call a similarly named method, create ACM county data record. If I open it, the method is very small, very crisp. You pass in ACM county record of type ACM county, and you call the create entity record and assign that ACM county record object to it. And once this flow runs, your object must be created, your object record must be created in this ACM county entity. So if I go in here, I have state code 16, I have county code 1, state name, the county name is Ada, state name is Idaho. You see how the state information has been associated with the county information. And then if I scroll over to the right, you will see that the datum WGS84 choice set has been associated with the county information. You can take this explanation and then apply it to the rest of the entities, right? By the time you get through one entity at a time, all the methods in this library will become very clear to you. So that is all for this video. I hope that I have been effective in communicating how a typical data service library can be implemented as part of the UiPath Solution Accelerator implementation. In the next video, we are going to be looking into the client-side processes, and we will start with the dispatcher process, and we will see how the dispatcher process will process the incoming files, and we will talk about the differences between how the UiPath Solution Accelerator implements it and how I have implemented it based on my requirements. So thank you for watching this video. If you like the content, please do like and subscribe to my channel. I truly appreciate it, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.